It's my privilege to introduce our plenary speaker this morning, our keynote speaker, Dan Oakes. Dan is a popular speaker in many places and was a popular speaker at AMCAP recently, and we're very grateful to have him back. Let me just tell you a little bit about him. You can see more in your program, of course. He is the current founder and director of Arizona's Family Institute. He has a practice in Mesa, Arizona. He holds a master's degree in education and counseling and is a licensed professional counselor and certified sexual addiction therapist and a clinically certified sex offender therapist with the National Association of Forensics Counselors. He has a trauma-informed care model that was highlighted by the National Council for Community Behavioral Health Care. He specializes in family issues relative to addiction, sexual conflict, and marital conflict. And he is a state president. His partner, Jared McGrath, whom I asked to give me some little tidbit about Dan that you might enjoy, said, Dan is really good at self-deprecation when he speaks. So you might want to know that he just has completed losing 35 pounds. So that's our self-deprecating information about Dan for the morning. Dan, welcome.
Thank you, Jared, for... To his credit, Jared is my partner and great support, and never letting me feel settled, said, I told him this week I hit the 30-pound mark, and he said, well, what do we have to do to get to 250? So we're going to keep going, and he's offered great incentives that aren't food-based, but adventure-based, and I'm excited about that. Make sure can you see that okay? I really want you to know what a special honor it is for me to present at AMCAP. I do speak quite a bit and I don't get too nervous, but I was surprised at how nervous I was this morning. Whenever I've seen plenary speakers at AMCAP, they're very research-based, and I am no researcher. I love researchers, though. I read everything they produce and watch their videos and try to find the best practices for the clients that I work with. And so the first time that I presented at AMCAP was a difficult moment. On June 25th of 2016, we found out that our daughter, Naomi, had leukemia. And we went to the hospital, and it seemed like for a solid month, every bit of news was bad news. At first, it was, what kind of leukemia is it? And then it's the kind we never want to find, and we have to treat it aggressively. So we entered the hospital June 25th, 2016. I'd already entered to present at AMCAP, was telling my wife, I'm not going. Obviously, I'm not going. We're in the hospital full time. We literally live there. She had to be there, they said, for 7 to 9 months. And she said, you're going? I said, I can't go. I can't think straight. I'll be up there feeling guilty that I'm not with you or her. And to the credit of my good wife, I came, and it was the first time I presented at AMCAP. After I got back from AMCAP, we learned that she was in remission, and she was only in the hospital for 5 months instead of 7 to 9. And you see how beautiful she is even without her hair. And so AMCAP is now kind of a good luck charm. I have to keep presenting to keep the good news coming, because we didn't get good news until I came. So last year when I presented, 2016, she was in complete remission and had half her hair back. And this was at a cancer camp a year later, and she just beams and is beautiful. And a year after, she started an organization called Nuke the Luke. And her first event, only a year after cancer, she and my wife, and I really credit them, I did very little, raised $10,000 for 2 cancer kids that they knew in the hospital. And this year, that's why my family or wife didn't come with me, because they're doing Nuke the Luke again, because September is Child Cancer Month. And we're 2 years out, and she is still in remission and healthy. The rates are good. When the day they told us she was in remission, they said she has a 70% chance of staying in remission, 30% chance of relapse, and that every year the odds go down, and we get to the 5-year mark, we will be less than 1% chance of relapse. So I have to keep presenting at AMCAP to keep the good news rolling. Of course, I'm kidding about that. I also want to thank quickly the wonderful, wonderful people that I work with at the Arizona Family Institute. We at the Institute have worked really hard to attract the best therapists. We give them the most financially positive opportunity. Most of our independent clinicians aren't giving us a portion. We intentionally want to attract good therapists and collaborate with them. Our primary goal is to be an institute of experts rather than to make money, sometimes to Jared's dismay. But we do well regardless. And those good people collaborate constantly with me and each other that frames out most of our clinical thought and practice as we work hard to educate each other and to be part of our clinical lives together. I'm just so blessed with good people in my life professionally. I'm just going to quickly go back here for a second. The antecedent to every other presentation I've done at AMCAP had been played out in other professional clinical settings. Meaning by the time I got to AMCAP, I had given the presentation so many times that I knew the material very well and had presented it several times, knew exactly how I wanted to teach it, or the pedagogy of how I might describe the information that I wanted to give. Today, however, to your detriment probably, this is the first time I've given this presentation. But if you look at how many sessions this week are on betrayal trauma, you probably could understand why. The real reason is in the history of couples work, because the history of couples work in the research is abysmal. Our outcomes were horrible across the board. Couples were as likely to not do well as they were to do well when they measured that, and lots of clinicians didn't like to do couples work because the outcomes weren't assured, or really because beyond affecting communication skills, we didn't have great tools until, and who can tell me until what? Thank you. Until emotionally focused therapy and this wonderful evidence-based program. Now here's the problem. I love EFT. It's really changed my clinical approach. But the EFT people say what? You can't use EFT with addiction, betrayal. And so it's kind of here's a great tool, and they at least theoretically pull it back. And for me, this really came to light several years ago when I worked at an agency that very specifically focused on sexual addiction. And I found in myself in these clinical arguments with the clinical director often about the way they would shame women or the hurt spouse for checking the history on their husband's computer or wanting to look at their phone. They would call this codependent behavior. And I would say, well, we know that the man is still lying. We know that he still acts out without telling his wife. How is the wife to create safety when he will not provide it? Well, and they would go on about kind of a very traditional view of codependency. Now, codependency is obviously real, but its misapplication I will talk about later in the presentation. So let me talk about a few of the objectives that I want to hit today. First, I want to clarify the differences and similarities to unrequited love, rejection, versus emotional and physical betrayal. And you may wonder, why do that? Just bear with me. I want to make some neurologic points based on those differences. And then second, we want to understand the role of emotional dysregulation in betrayal. And if you're familiar at all with Alan Shore's work, that will be a review a bit. We want to explain the process of applying trauma-informed care to betrayal. I'm going to suggest to you that applying trauma-informed care adds a richness that then allows us to use the tools from EFT, but there are some prerequisites to do that. And I'm going to say openly that this is my attempt to create and understand what tools we need to make EFT effective. It's how much I believe in that process. What is it we need to add? What is it we have to change in a betrayal model or a trauma model where there's been a great deal of pain or abuse? What do we have to add to make that tool more effective and more usable? Number 4, I want to understand the metaphor of communication and safety as a clinical function. And ultimately what you'll see is that we are the metaphor. The unspoken method of communication in the session provides the metaphor that the couple unconsciously follows while they consciously follow direction and practice. And then last, how to apply and teach others the structure and value of empathy and accountability in healing betrayal. It is currently my position that when the offending spouse can adopt an emotional attitude of empathy and accountability, then things will change. Other tools in EFT become more applicable. So in the past, I've always presented in smaller rooms. It was great to get lots of discussion going. I really like that. I know it's more difficult here. So I would like to do some of that, but I'm not sure about the time and how hard it might be to get comments from the back of the room. But let's begin a little bit with where betrayal always begins. Betrayal always begins with trust. It always begins with the hope of connectedness and even the reality of connectedness. You can't have, obviously, betrayal without it. Martin Luther made this comment, and ironically, what betrayal was Martin Luther up in arms about? He did not believe, at least in several things, but one particular was the Catholic Church's ability to reframe paying for indulgence. That if somebody would pay money, the indulgence they were confessing would be forgiven. He saw this as obviously a betrayal of a sacred spiritual trust. And I think it's ironic because what do you think were the indulgences? Individuals were paying money to the church for forgiveness. And I think in the context of our conversation, it's the sin that's common to man. Sexual sin. That I'm sure of all of the indulgences Martin Luther was up in arms about, that somebody could just pay the church for repentance. This was a sexual betrayal of the ministry, that somehow repentance was reduced to the payment of money. I'm hoping you see the metaphor of this. But this beginning trust really starts at such a young age. We're all born with that instinct to reach out and connect. The way your 1-year-old stumbles to you when they're in distress, with their arms out or their arms up. The brain, from the very beginning, seeks a connection with other. It is how we are hardwired. And I don't think, at least I didn't think I would need to go into much research about attachment theories for us to be on the same page with that attitude and belief. Its primary function, however, neurologically, is to seek safety. There is, in the context of our neural pathways, a recognition that is primarily self-protective. That as long as I am part of the tribe, I feel safer than if I am kicked out of the tribe. It is biologic that we know or sense unconsciously, even at a young, unknowing age, that safety is with others. This young feeling maybe in the past was demoralized as codependence or overdependence. We know now never leaves us. It does not go away. We always seek for the connection that helps us emotionally regulate, that helps us feel calm and safe. There is no shame in desiring connection. There is no codependence that is negating of our need to be close to other. And this, the researchers, and not even psychologists, neurologists tell us very specific things about what this connection looks like. When they measure the brain about what connects people, they list about 5 or 6 very specific traits. Things like eye contact, smile, touch, tone, movement, and sugar. These things light up our brain all over. You know, when they do PEC scans with somebody that's swinging a hammer or writing with a pen, one little spot of the brain lights up to perform that function. But when we're face to face with an old friend or a lover and we're laughing, guess what happens in the brain? The whole brain is lit up. It's alive. So these neurologic tendencies to connect are both obvious spiritually and scientifically. One of my favorite researchers has this quote that I repeat regularly. This is Bruce Perry out of Texas. He does trauma work with children. He's an MD. Here's what he says: the brain is designed to promote relationships. Specific parts of the human brain respond to emotional cues, such as facial expression, touch, scent, and more important, allow us to get pleasure from positive human interactions. The systems of the brain that mediate pleasure appear to be closely connected to the systems that mediate emotional relationship. It is the greatest good, our connection with others. I was just talking before I stood up with friends at the table about our first granddaughter that we have, and what absolute joy fills my brain and my heart when she says, "Papa," and smiles at me or waves and kisses me goodbye or hello. There is no other place. There is no intensity, no roller coaster, no drug. There is nothing else that I want in the world than those kinds of feelings. So what happens then when love goes awry? And there's really 3 categories of this that I want to briefly talk about. The first is unrequited love. This is the longing of love, the girl in high school that I always wanted to have a relationship with, but it never happened. The person that you long for that was never interested in you. I think Arthur Uchtdorf has a funny quote about that. The other then is actual rejection, is that I make some connection either socially or interpersonally, and then a rejection comes. I am rebuffed or pushed away. And then the third is actual betrayal, that once an absolute bond is formed, once there is loving connection, a betrayal occurs, and it shatters that bonded place that our brain so earnestly seeks. Now, why is it important to discuss these? I found this little cartoon. The man says, to his current girlfriend about this other woman. This is Jen, my longtime unrequited love, who somehow knows to call me just as I stop thinking about her. Jen, this is Lisa. So unrequited love is common in adolescence and in our early 20s, and it really at any time in our life, but doesn't carry the pain that other forms of love can have. And so rejection is something really starts to happen neurologically when rejection takes place, because this is where real pain begins. And let's talk for a second about the evidence of that pain. Guy Winch, if you've read his books or listened to his TED Talks, he says the answer is our brains are wired to respond that way. When scientists place people in functional MRI machines and asked them to recall a recent rejection, they discovered something amazing. The same areas of the brain become activated when we experience rejection as when we experience physical pain. That's why even small rejections hurt more than we think they should, because they elicit literal, albeit emotional, pain. This topic seemed very interesting to me, so several months ago I started reviewing the research on articles that talked about this idea of social and or emotional rejection and its neurologic impact in the brain relative to physical pain. And just look at how many articles I found, and this was only the first page of the search. I reviewed several of the articles, and I just decided I really want you to know the research is well established about the nature of rejection and physical pain. So rejection begins this mimicked response of the brain of physical pain. That's why sometimes rejection makes you feel sick to your stomach, or gives you a headache, or you over-worry about something, but we are not even to betrayal yet. The power of betrayal to create intense physical pain, and I literally look for images to try to communicate the pain that we often see in those hurt spouses. And I know stereotypically, it's especially in addiction work, it's a female hurt spouse. But I've done the work long enough to know that when you switch it, when the betrayal is a female and the hurt spouse is a male, the emotions are identical. The idea that somehow a man is going to be more emotionally regulated with betrayal than a woman is ridiculous. They are just as obsessive, just as much emotional and physical pain that they feel in their body. Betrayal can devastate. It can shatter and explode a heart and a soul. And that pain that they feel is mitigated by many factors. Now, here's the good news. The good news is I have met with couples where the woman is deeply disappointed, but her sense of self-esteem, her sense of her connectedness to others besides her husband, really can alleviate a lot of that difficulty. So the comments I'm making today don't apply to every couple. Many repair a betrayal, and they do it well, and they don't always need therapy to do it. We often think way too much of ourselves. But those that are in great pain, they do need help. The emotion gets very dysregulated. One of the best descriptions of betrayal that I've seen comes from Michelle Mays, who's a clinician in Washington, D.C. She runs a center called the Center for Relational Recovery. And she has this threefold awareness of what betrayal does to the heart and mind. First, she talks about the attachment trauma, the loss of the love, the loss of the one you're dependent on for safety and for comfort. She talks about the sexual trauma. What now images are in my head when I attempt to be sexual with my partner? What intrusive thoughts, what obsessive thoughts? The sexual trauma of that betrayal. not to mention, in my opinion, and not in every case though, emotional and psychological trauma that comes from intimidation, manipulation, gaslighting. I will tell you that gaslighting has become a common term, but most offending spouses gaslight unintentionally. I've gaslighted before, let me tell you. Here comes self-deprecation. Saying to my wife, well, if you keep buying food like this, I will keep gaining weight. You see how this is a little bit of gaslighting? This is your responsibility, my weight loss. And as soon as it slips out of my mouth, I'm wanting to capture it all back. As she looks at me like, really? And spoons made you fat. But the deep psychological trauma through manipulation, intimidation, and often the continuation of addictive behavior well into attempted repair. I'm just wanting to help you understand, as if you don't, but just to demonstrate the absolute physiologic pain. And we all know, if you don't, Gottman talks about the two criteria, two prerequisites for divorce, the two primary factors that produce divorce. Anybody know what those are? Contempt, and the second one, physiologic distress. That when I'm with my spouse, I feel my gut wrenches, my head hurts, I'm anxious about what might happen. Physiologic distress. We cannot survive in a relationship where that physiologic distress happens. Now, so the only reason I wanted to differentiate is so that you understand the reality in the neurology and the physicality of the pain of betrayal, how real it is. And when we sit down in an office and do communication work, we're not addressing the core issues. Now, little story. I grew up in Liberty, Missouri. That's a unique place for this Mormon crowd, right? And we lived on a farm out of town on the northeast side of Liberty. And tornadoes were not uncommon. But I can distinctly remember as a boy standing in the front yard, and everything seemed extremely calm and yellowish, very dark clouds above, and I could feel the hair on my arm and the back of my neck standing up, as if there was extra amount of electromagnetic energy in the air, but mostly I could sense something was wrong and something was about to happen. I remember that my parents were in the yard as well, and they were talking, and I think the only reason I remember this event is because of my hyper-awareness about trying to figure out what was about to happen. And of course, my parents took me, and we had literally a root cellar. We went down to the root cellar. Chaos happened outside. I could hear noise. Very traumatic and scary. And then we come out and we see some destruction and whatnot, and the tornado didn't come right over our house. But it made me think a little bit about what happens before disclosure. What happens when the hurt spouse doesn't know they're being hurt, and they have this attuned hypersensitivity. They know something is wrong. They can't put their finger on it. They're interpreting every glance. They're looking at every movement and trying to get some recognition about what's happening. This is the beginning of gaslighting, because a spouse in this state will say, "What is wrong? What's happening?" And the response is often, "What are you talking about? Nothing's wrong," right? Here's a quote that we hear many of our hurt spouses say: "I knew something was wrong, but I could not put my finger on it. He was distant and off. I just could not get him to see me." You see how This is the beginning of rejection. It's the unspoken rejection. And so the emotional regulation starts to elevate in the hurt spouse. My point in all of this is that disclosure is not the beginning. Disclosure only represents this emotional shift where the hurt spouse transitions from a position of high emotional awareness, highly attuned to every detail, and then shifts into a dissociative or angry state, pulling away, shutting down, protecting herself. The emotions and awareness of connection are now depleted. And often, the offending spouse is shifting from a deeply hidden, shameful emotional state and then shifting into this freedom state, like, finally I've said it. Finally it's out. And this emotional map begins to dysregulate between them because they're both having extremely different expectations about what should happen in this chaotic moment. So here is a quote by Alan Shore. I am a psychological disciple of Alan Shore. If I can convince you at all to read any of his work, he does not talk about addiction or betrayal per se. He talks a great deal about attachment, but here's one of my favorite quotes. And I'm going to do some interpretation, not that you need it, but he's a heady writer. It is now established. Now, what does this mean? When a researcher of this caliber, I suggest, says it is now established, what does that mean? It means the research has been done so many times by so many different people in so many different settings. It's now established that emotions are the highest order of direct expressions of bioregulation in complex organisms. And when I share this with people that aren't clinicians, I tell them, what he's saying is humans are complex organisms and we need each other to bioregulate, to emotionally regulate. That the maturation of the neuromechanisms involved in self-regulation is experience dependent, meaning we learn it through experiences. And that these critical affective experiences are embedded in the attachment relationship. This means change happens relationally. It happens in the context of our relationship with other. Not only does change happen in that way, that's good news for us, it means that all emotional regulation has an element associated with other. Let me give you a very basic childhood example. A little boy goes to school for the first day, gets so terrified he runs back from the bus station. Mom's got to drive him there just because he's so scared. For 4 days, he keeps coming home, not too scared to get on the bus. Mom's frustrated, I don't know what to do, but she nurtures him profoundly, helps him and helps him. And finally, the day that he gets on the bus, what he doesn't even recognize, though, is that in his mind, he imagined running home and being hugged by his mother. The emotional state dissipates. He gets on the bus. The next day is a little better. But you see, the mechanism is not independence. The mechanism is knowing that I can. See, for a child, this idea that I'm leaving mother, they're still struggling with the reality. Are they going to really still be there? I have to go back and check. Otherwise, my anxiety goes up. It's like when I was a teenager, I would come in the house and say, Mom, where's Mom? And she'd say, what do you want? I don't want nothing. I just want to know where you were at, that I would go on, right? But it is now established that we emotionally regulate, primarily through our relationships. So let's talk a little bit about this emotional regulation model. That there's this optimal state of functioning that constitutes emotional regulation. And there's two divergent experiences out of emotional regulation. And the first is this hypo-dysregulation, meaning I'm going to shut down, I'm going to pull away. And the second is a hyper-dysregulation, where I'm going to have to freak out. I'm going to externalize this anxiousness. It's going to come out of my body. It's going to sound loud. It's going to sound intense. The emotional regulated state is manifested by an attuned response to others and their emotions, a responsiveness, an adaptiveness, that difficult things can happen around me and I can attune to those changes. I can adapt to those changes. The hyperdysregulation is manifested by an activated, externalized, and chaotic emotional state. And the hypodysregulation is withdrawn, isolated, and rigid. These two metaphoric relational themes of chaos and rigidity really do represent the neurology in our body of self-protection. If a bear comes through this door, I will either run that way or I will shrink into a ball and freeze. And that's my sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system doing its job to try to attempt to protect me. And we would never call it dysregulated, right? If it was a bear, we would all say that's a completely appropriate response to this set of circumstances. So the idea of dysregulation means that something feels out of sorts, that there doesn't seem to be an obvious threat, but we tend to act and respond in ways that are designed to protect us. Affectively, yes?
On your emotional regulation, as I look at those words, it reminds me of A.R.E. by Sue Johnson.
Yes.
Are you there for me?
Absolutely.
And so what you're saying is if the husband can learn to get a perfect score on that, the wife, or vice versa also.
Absolutely, that is the case. You see the dilemma. What he said was, this sounds a lot like Sue Johnson's ARE. Are you there for me? Are you available? But you can see if I am a hurt spouse, I do want you to be there for me, but there's something now in my physiology that cannot see you as safe, no matter what. And so the difficulty with which I can reach to you is evident. And the problem is it's hard for us to see it as a bear in the room, as a tiger, right? It's hard sometimes for us to recognize because the offending spouse is now talking so softly on the couch. And we don't see the activated internal conflict. And this is exactly why Sue and others have said we don't use EFT in these ways, because we don't use it in abuse. If it was a physical abuser and the woman had bruises on her face, we would be much more conscientious about saying to her spouse, now just reach to him and say, right? Okay, I just wanted to demonstrate affectively what those states seem like. An activated state in that famous picture of the scream, or what that withdrawn, cold place. If I had $100 for every time a woman said to me, I just sat in my closet most of the day. I didn't know how to feel safe. I sat under my clothes. It is a scary place. The great metaphor of emotional regulation really exists in this biblical moment when the storm is around the apostles and they go to the Savior. What would you have us do? Will we die? And he stands, calms the seas, calms them. It's definitely we need the Savior to help us. But also, he wants us to be like him. He wants us to have a sense of peaceability in chaos. Recently, I was at a meeting with Elder Rasband and Elder Ballard. They came to Arizona, met with only stake presidents. And Elder Ballard said two things that changed my personal spiritual life and my ministering spiritual life. The first thing he said was, he said, "Brother, what is the most important thing you can do?" And we all, of course, were coming up with wonderful ideas. We wanted to say the right thing and be impressive to Elder Ballard. And, of course, I said nothing. I was terrified. It was my first meeting. But he said, "Brethren, be clear. The most valuable thing you will ever do is teach inspiringly about the Savior." That's changed everything about how I teach any doctrine of the gospel. But here's the other thing he said that really got my clinical ears up, because he said it is only in the gospel of Jesus. He said lots of other people in the world have great happiness. They feel the Spirit of Christ in their hearts. They're Heavenly Father's children have great happiness. Only in the gospel of Jesus Christ is the greatest capacity for peacefulness amidst chaos. And my thoughts and attitudes clinically about emotional regulation perked up, and I thought, oh, that was beautiful. So the metaphor, the religious metaphor of Christ calming the sea and emotional regulation, and we need many metaphors for that. Am I right that it's 9:22? I'm just trying to get my time right, and I'm done at 9:45. Is that right? Okay. I'm going to speed up a little bit. So let's put this in context of the great dilemma that sits in front of us on a couch with a hurt couple with lots of pain. Let's break out this regulation for each. First, for the hurt spouse. And notice, even though stereotypically I might say women and men, there is no difference in the dysregulation relative to gender. None. And the things we have to do are the same. So I use gender-neutral descriptions to describe these two positions, even though I will lapse into stereotypical language. The hurt spouse, when they dysregulate up or down, that looks very different. It can be verbal and physical aggression, obsessive fear, intrusive thoughts, and they can be highly critical. Why did you do this? Why do you hurt me? What are you doing now? And the downregulated state is an avoidance state, a withdrawn state, a depressed state, full of isolation, emotional, and unresponsive. And what they report often, but not always, is that they see themselves cycling, and it produces great chaos. Why in the morning I can't even get out of bed, but by dinner time all I want to do is yell at everyone in the house, right? And our job begins to reframe their emotional dysregulation empathetically as self-protective. We want to affirm and help them understand their brain and their body are trying to protect themselves. Alice Gedahakis has a great quote. She says, "The process of dissociation is an elegant mechanism built into the human psychological system as a form of escape from sometimes literally going crazy. The problem with checking out so thoroughly is that it can leave us feeling dead inside with little or no ability to feel or feelings in our bodies." This is exactly what I hear from hurt spouses. They do not know where to find safety anymore. And their brain is panicking. Likewise, the offending spouse dysregulates. His can look very different. And I am not painting a broad brush. Not all offending spouses do this. Some are extremely contrite and humble and very attuned to the pain they've caused. But those that need help the most often look this way. Their hyper-dysregulation is defensive, blaming, aggressive, gaslighting, rationalizing, and full of resentment. Their down-regulated state, their hypo-dysregulation, is often about self-pity, shame, an intense victim posture, self-destructive, and full of isolation. And they do the same. They vacillate back and forth. One minute they'll feel motivated, the next minute they're angry at their wife, and the next minute down. We do the same with them. Our role is the same. We're reframing constantly that these difficult emotional states, these highly intense up states or low intensity states, are their body's attempt to self-protect. The problem is that when you put them in the room together, in the house together, in the bed together, in the car together, with kids who are screaming in the back, that gets me going with no other stressor. Then great chaos begins. And they report, we can't stay in this marriage. We can't ever see eye to eye. He keeps blaming me. And we see, in a very EFT-like way, the way their dysregulated states trigger their partner's dysregulated state. When he goes up, she goes down. When she goes up, he goes down. And it's like a slide that never ends. And they feel that they do not have the capacity to manage this emotional chaos or crazy making that they feel. So this is where, in the emotional regulation system, we have to then apply this sense of betrayal trauma and understanding it as purely traumatic. I am admitting to you my attempt to find images that evoke emotion in you. They come into our office and they usually will do their hair and put on clean clothes, and they'll talk in a more regulated way. They'll present themselves as good as they can. The reality often is that at home and in the car and in the shower, they sob in the shower. They scream in the closet. They don't do their hair for days, right? And this is all about the PTSD, the trauma, relative to the intense physical pain they feel now from even the ghosts of what have happened. And fear is a great liar, and it needs to be. Fear exaggerates all harms for the purpose of self-protection. You see the continued reframe. I tell couples, if a spider came from under the couch and stood and it was a big spider, we'd all be freaked out. And then if we went back under the couch, what we would all see in our heads? We would see bigger spiders coming over the couch, down our neck. We would see crazy things that may never happen. But fear's doing its job. What does it want us to do? It wants us to kill the spider. And if it was real, I tell often the spouse, your husband and I would move the couch, we would find the spider, and we would kill it. And our fear would keep exaggerating until we ensured safety. So this metaphor that fear lies to us. A, it's going to repeat things we know that happened with our spouse, and B, it's going to give us images, if I'm the hurt spouse, of things that maybe never happened because our body is saying, get away from him or her. They have hurt you. Pull away. So we continually reframe that. And often that fear is the shadow of what has actually happened. It's stuck in time. This thing has happened to me in the past. It happened last year. It happened 6 months ago. And I still see it in my head every day. I see him meeting with her, that woman, or I see him looking at porn, or I see him noticing somebody in a room. Even when it doesn't happen, it's the shadow of the actual moment in time. And it's because trauma lives in our nervous system. Bessel van der Kolk has told us for a while now, if you haven't read his book, you should. It is stuck in the body, but the body doesn't forget. And why? To protect us. You see, the constant validation of these intense negative emotions is what reframes. And I can't reiterate enough being cautious about not misusing the term of codependency. Here's a great example. Why can't you raise your self-esteem so then you can raise mine? Right? This is a codependent state, but it really blames the other person. In our work, this often sounds like this: if you could just forgive me, I wouldn't be so angry. What they really mean: your fear and mistrust of me is very shaming and inconvenient, so I will emotionally punish you until you can be kind to me first. Sometimes the offending spouse is waiting for the safety of the hurt spouse to say, it'll all be okay, wanting her to be a rescuer. And he can't feel safe enough to come down into that place for her. Luckily, the tide is changing. The clinical work. Some of the actual individuals, in my mind and in the history of the work, responsible for misusing codependency, their actual children are now doing research to shape that. That, of course, was a implication of the Carnes work, and I love Pat Carnes. I think he did amazing clinical work, but the early addiction work, the way they used codependency was literally addicts using it to say, my wife is as sick as me. This is the greatest gaslighting lie of them all, right? That the enabler is as sick as the addict. I just don't believe it. The enabler is a response to the addiction, to the craziness of living with it. And so these great works, Facing Heartbreak by Carnsley and Rodriguez, is phenomenal in its shift from that organization and those entities into a new awareness of trauma associated with betrayal. Minding a Shattered Heart, another book by Stephanie Carnes, which is just wonderful. And my favorite, Worthy of Her Trust by Atterburn Martinkus. These guys are phenomenal. They're deeply religious, good men. And they really reframe the accountability and responsibility that we hold. So, with this shift, understanding emotional regulation and now understanding and applying trauma, what do we do? Now, first, what I'm not going to spend time on today is talking about how the hurt spouse or offending spouse, prior to this moment of wanting to repair with each other, the things they really need to do to own their own emotional regulation. I'll give you a peek into that of the things that I like the most in this area. And those are themes of self-compassion, if you know Kristen Neff's work. Obviously, a connection with others besides my spouse to find safety. I have to know I have safety, right? If I'm going to go into this session and try to repair with this spouse that has hurt me so often, I really have got to be prepared to go somewhere else if that doesn't work. I've got to know I can be safe in the world. My connection with others. And Kristen Neff talks about this, so valuable because when we connect with others, we see ourselves as common to humanity, recognizing that any individual, any woman, any betrayed spouse would feel this way. I am not broken because of the fear that I have. And finally, mindfulness, relative specifically to avoiding over-identification with intense emotion. We are not our emotions, our sense of presence through emotion, using the Christ in the storm metaphor again. So many great tools in this area to help calm those individuals, but I'm not spending elaborate time there. I'm telling you that work must be done before good repair work in the betrayal system can be done. But here's our ultimate goal. That ultimate goal for healing, has two basic criteria that among all the other activities we can do clinically, we must see these two as pillars in the repair of the betrayed relationship. First, the hurt spouse has to eventually live in a system where she can share fear openly. She can say it with no fear of retribution, intimidation, or anger. Here is my favorite defense mechanism from an offending spouse. A favorite because I love to debunk it quickly and lovingly when they say, she's not using the atonement. And I almost want to come out of my chair and strangle him by the neck, but I know that I have to model the very empathy I want him to have. So we have to confront that issue, recognizing it as self-protective to his shame, and help him find a different path. The offending spouse must learn and express empathy and accountability. When these two things happen, healing begins. An attuned response begins. But then there is one final piece that must occur relative to the trauma that we know is present. And I'll say to the offending spouse, if you want to heal things quickly, if you really want to understand this work and what it is for you to do, you must provide empathy and accountability in her most dysregulated state. When she is most scared, angry, hurt, this is your greatest opportunity to heal her heart. And this empathy and accountability, we have to train. There are some key elements that I will speak about in this brief overview of this process. First, hoping you see this okay, the first clinical objective for the therapist is calming dysregulated emotion with pace and empathy. So we're going to empathize to the pain they experience when they're dysregulated, but we're pacing it. This, of course, comes from EFT. We're slowing the emotions down, helping them see what's really happening, what fear is present. Fear that I'm not good enough, fear that I will get hurt again. And as we slow it down, it becomes self-evident to them. Their dysregulated state really is dysregulation. Their brain is moving so fast, they are so flooded, all they can do is self-protect. And that will never provide attunement. We are reframing extreme emotion as self-protective. And we're doing it in the most calming and loving way possible. Something Alan Shore would call change happens with a therapist that is experience near. The individual's presence can feel your closeness to them. I've had people say to me, you got to stop. Stop what? Stop being so nice to me. I don't trust it. I don't trust people that are nice. And you hear the pings of past traumas. Number 3, we're working with and encouraging the offending spouse to seek out the pain of the hurt spouse. Not just in therapy, we're helping them develop this ritual that every day, honey, how's your pain today? How are you today? I want to know. I want to be here for you when you're scared. For them, this is terrifying. This means I feel like I'm stepping into a pit of snakes. We don't do that as humans. We don't go into vulnerability. We avoid it, right? She might get angry. She might be hurt. She might actually tell me how scared she is. Yes, brother, that's what you want. Our other role there is that we're protecting the hurt spouse's fear and providing safety and structure. We have to be willing to stop a session or to tell a couple, you're not ready to move forward. There'll be too much pain. You will re-traumatize her in this very session when you are that angry. We have to keep engaging them. Sue Johnson might say we have to engage the withdrawer, and that sometimes takes some extra work outside of the couples session. Rules for the offending spouse. I hate the word rules, but I really couldn't come up with something else, but this is what we're trying to induce in them. Number 1, there is no convincing or apologizing. In this attuned moment, I'm not saying I'm sorry, I'm not trying to convince them I'm good now. This will only trigger her nervous system to self-protect because she doesn't trust it. She's heard an apology 1,000 times, and you attempt to convince her will automatically trigger a self-protective mechanism. She'll pull away. So our goal is not convincing and apologizing. I say that first because that seems to be the first inclination. It seems like the right thing to do. Think for a second, if my spouse says, you don't even love me. And I say, well, of course I do. Can't you see everything I'm doing? I'm doing this, I'm doing this. Can't you see? It seems like the right response to stick up for myself. But the implicit message is, you are wrong, and I will correct you. We want them to seek to soothe her fear. And they will admittedly say things, I have no idea how to do that. Their shame is completely in the way, their defensiveness. But we have to help them find that. We have to empathy practice. I can see how. We teach him to reflect. We teach the offending spouse to reflect on how past events create pain now. We have to be specific about past harm and present fear. I can see how when I did that then, it leaves you scared now. This is the structure, the trauma-informed care structure. Rules for the hurt spouse: know your readiness. When couples come and they want to do repair work, my first session is about determining her readiness and helping her know how to assess what I'm assessing. That's the other thing I'm not doing today, is talking a lot about PTSD assessment. Those are wonderful things to do if you know Kevin Skinner at all and his work that he's done for himself and that he's doing with CSAC community. Phenomenal assessments, really great stuff. Know your readiness. Know where else you can go, because there's no guarantee this moment's going to work out right away, because we're going to make a lot of mistakes before we get to a good place. And our goal is a calm expression of fear. She has to own her own emotional regulation. The irony is we're helping her see that calm place is the only place she can fully express her fear. It's the only place that can literally happen. In the dysregulated places, the fear gets blocked. Yes. Don't expect absolute resolution, and appreciate fear as self-protective. Now, I have 2 minutes. I want to run through this quick dialogue for you. Here's what it might sound like. I get so scared that I see images in my head of things you may have done, and they don't stop. I just want to scream. I can totally see how that can scare you so, because I did hurt you, and I am sure I'm very scary to you sometimes. When you were on the phone, I was imagining that you were talking to another woman. I get so angry and scared, I can't seem to stop feeling that way. I can see how that would scare you. I do that. I did do that in the past. Is there anything I can do right now to help you feel safe? She has to be able to sense that she has a safe place to share fear. She has to think, I have a fear, and I can share it with you. And he has to think, I can understand how I have hurt you, and I accept accountability for the pain and I have caused. I want to care for you and nurture you now. I am committed deeply to helping couples heal. We know the power of this great new and everlasting covenant of marriage is unique to our culture, our religion, our faith. It is our great responsibility to determine and do all we can to help these wonderful couples change. I have made one observation that I'll end with. If you are a clinician and you have not yet had a couple that has made it through serious betrayal, there might be doubt in you that it's possible. I assure you, change is possible. Not just because of the atonement, because what the atonement does to our heart and mind and body. We can be like him. We can overcome fear. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.